Hello, I'm Ibrahim Imam, and welcome to this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. In this episode, we will continue our exploration of Parkinson's disease. The last episode on this subject was titled White Out, When the Brain Loses Its Black Stuff. There, we discussed the clinical and pathological features of Parkinson's disease. In this episode, I'll be speaking to Dr. Alberto Espay, co-author of the book titled Brain Fables. And this is to further explore the pathology that is driving Parkinson's and other brain neurodegenerative diseases. Brain Fables is subtitled The Hidden History of Neurodegenerative Diseases and a Blueprint to Conquer Them. This was quite an ambitious book. Dr. Espay co-authored this with Parkinson's disease patient and advocate Benjamin Stecher, and it was selected by the Association of American Publishers for the Prose Award, which honors the best scholarly work in neuroscience published in 2020. Dr. Espay is Professor and Endowed Chair of the James J. and Joan A. Gardner Center for Parkinson's Disease at the University of Cincinnati. Apart from publishing over 350 peer-reviewed research articles, Dr. Espay has also published 9 other books, including Common Movement Disorders Pitfalls. This received the highly commended BMA Medical Book Award in 2013. Dr. Espay has served as chair of the Movement Disorders section of the American Academy of Neurology, as associate editor of the Movement Disorders Journal, and as a member of the executive committee of the Parkinson Study Group. Among other honors, he has received the Cincinnati Business Courier's Healthcare Hero Award, the Spanish Society of Neurologists Courtiers Award, and the honorary membership of the Mexican Academy of Neurology. You could say he's a global neurologist. His 2022 TEDx presentation titled Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, The Solution in Sight, was selected from more than 12,000 global entries for 2 2023 Telly Awards, which honor excellence in video and television across all screens. Dr. Espay currently serves as president of the Pan-American section of the International Parkinsons and Movement Disorders Society, and he directs the first biomarker study of aging, the CCBP Study. This is a trial that is designed to match people with neurodegenerative disorders to available therapies from which they are most biologically suitable to benefit, regardless of clinical diagnosis. Dr. Alberto Espay, welcome to the Neurology Lounge podcast, and I'm most grateful that you accepted my invitation to discuss your book. Alberto is in a conference, and he has had to find somewhere suitable for this. He is a busy man, and I'm quite happy that you found time for me today.
Thank you for your flexibility in accommodating the time for me as well.
Thank you very much. Why did you write the book? Let's start with that. Why did you think of writing this book on brain fables, and of course the interesting title?
Well, thank you, Ibrahim. It was, I think, a convoluted story, but it began in one day when I had to start working on a presentation that I had been given the task titled Redefinition of Parkinson's Disease. Now, this was in 2015, and in 2015, we had new criteria for Parkinson's disease, and a committee of experts that gathered together and essentially created a new criteria for Parkinson's. And ostensibly, my task was to discuss the differences between this new criteria, presumably an improved, enhanced version of how to make a diagnosis of Parkinson's versus the old one. But the title, Redefinition of Parkinson's, struck me as a bit too much for what were in fact fairly comparable criteria, admittedly with better language, but it's still in the realm of man-made constructs. We figure it's time to rebuild this house. Let's put it together with new bricks. Let's put it together with new doors, etc. And so now we have a new definition of Parkinson. It's when I began to think, what makes us clinicians the arbiters of what is and isn't at a biological level? And that sort of led me from one thing to another, looking into sort of the sources of what is it that we thought about to create this idea of Parkinson's. And the more I delved into it, the more I realized that it was an idea of a time that no longer was with us. It was a time when we had very little technology. We essentially had to wait till people died to examine their brains under a microscope to be able to try to piece together how their life story had been. And the book came as a result of recognizing that there was an original sin committed during the creation of Parkinson's, which was the violation of a 101 rule in forensics. When you come to a crime scene,
Yes.
in the 1900s, that was the brain autopsy. What you saw there was the corpses. We later came to have names for them, such as antibodies and amyloid plaques, and they should have been the victims, but we made them out to be the perpetrators of the crime. We felt that that was the cause of the whole thing, and that concept has never left us. And that's sort of how Brain Fables ended up being thought of as a project.
Yeah, that's, and that, how did you kind of go about writing it? You decided to do with a patient who has Parkinson's.
Yes. So let me tell you a little bit about Ben Stetcher. So Ben Stetcher is someone who, in his 20s, was in China. He had a company that had businesses there, and he developed his very first symptoms when he was in China, but recognized that needed to learn a lot more. So came back to his native Canada, Toronto is where he's from, and decided that he was going to travel all over the world to go to every laboratory and every center that was doing anything for Parkinson's.
Okay.
And as a millennial, he had a blog that he was creating about all of his experiences and interviews with different people and centers. And eventually he talked to me, and I thought that he was very taken by the idea that the things that we were doing in Cincinnati, where I work,
Yes.
were a little crazier for the times. And he figured that maybe we needed to talk more. And we ended up talking and recognizing that we were both saying the same thing. He was very skeptical from his side as well, representing, of course, a very unusual form of Parkinson's. And then he decided to move to Cincinnati for some time to continue think through these ideas and in fact help us with what we have since taken a larger deal of effort into, which is our Cincinnati cohort biomarker program, the CCBP. So Ben provided the patient voice to the science behind every chapter, and every chapter was one pivotal moment on the history of how we came to this idea of Parkinson's, with its many beautiful, I have to admit, very beautiful components to it. And we therefore realized that to present the science, the evidence, and the patient voice sort of strung together was a good, compelling idea of truly talking about what a fable we've created. It's a beautiful, compelling, elegant idea. But false. It's
Well, I think it worked very well. I enjoyed the mixture of the. So it's kind of a meeting of two skeptical minds. And right from the beginning, it sounded like a revolutionary book. In the preface, you said neurodegenerative diseases do not exist, which is kind of a bold statement. And you said there are labels that neurologists created before we had the insight and tools to accurately define them. Is this just relating to the pathophysiology, or are you kind of also including the clinical bits of it. As neurologists, we kind of know this and this and this add up to Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Does it dismantle even the clinical bit, or is just the pathophysiology you were looking at? Okay.
What it needs to break apart is the concept that this is a molecular biological entity. So the models were thought of as predicting the therapeutic efficacy, and we have complete allegiance to the model. In fact, the National Institutes of Health would not support a grant of a molecule for presumed neuroprotection in humans if it hasn't been demonstrated to be neuroprotective in animal models.
I suppose that takes us back to one of the models you criticize, which is the MPTP model, which emerged when heroin addicts were exposed to MPTP contaminated heroin. You said that model may have done more to slow down than to accelerate the development of disease-modifying therapies for Parkinson's. Is it because the model is wrong? Is there something wrong with it? Or is it because it doesn't represent the large section of people with Parkinson's disease?
Both. So let's go back to the clinics. Those individuals that had MPTP-related toxicity are those that today we would have never diagnosed as Parkinson's disease. They had an overnight development of an axial predominant tremorless Parkinsonism with early postural impairment, falls, apraxia of eyelid opening. They had waxy cataplexy. They have all sorts of features that we know aren't ever part of Parkinson's disease. Yet it became the model of Parkinson's disease. And of course, it's a toxic model, meaning that you have a molecule that destroys the nigrostriatal system. Yes. And that is appealing. We think that's Parkinson's. And of course, that's not Parkinson's. It can be many, many different things, but it became the model of Parkinson's. And the reason we argue it's been a regressive force is because it's held us hostage onto an idea that it's been compelling, that Parkinson's is a nigral degenerative disease, and this one is a way to test molecules that are essentially going to make that better.
I suppose we were desperate for a model, and I think one came along where everybody jumped onto.
Exactly. Yeah. But if you look at the number of MPTP-based research, it continues to increase. It doesn't matter that it has never, ever predicted any molecule that would translate into benefits. It's fascinating. It's a thriving business for research. It's certainly a great source for writing papers. And that's about it.
What about the CONTUSI model? Is that better? Because at least that's kind of not an acute form of Parkinson's. That's the genetic Parkinson's detected in this large CONTUSI kindred, which has been linked to the SNCA gene. Again, is your objection to this model because it is wrong? Because it looks like it's a real Parkinson's.
Well, so that model can only apply to people who have a mutation in the synuclein gene, the SNCA gene. To probably very few others, but we are again assuming that this is the overall problem with Parkinson's. And in fact, if you fast forward to now, we have a test of synuclein called the seed amplification assay that is being built as a quote biological definition of Parkinson's, violating the concept that there are many biologies associated with Parkinson's, violating the concept that a test of pathology does not make it a identification of biology, and suggesting that this is the problem with Parkinson's. Still today, we think that synuclein is the central villain. And so, of course, what happens in people with synuclein mutations is that the synuclein protein that the gene should generate becomes very unstable. It does aggregate or clump into the pathology called as Lewy bodies. And what happens is, as the process continues in an accelerated fashion, immediately by virtue of the genetic influence, the normal protein depletes. And so you get a loss of synuclein quite a bit. Now, none of these models are intending to measure how much less of the normal protein there is. They're all about only one end of protein homeostasis, which is the insoluble state, which is the end state of protein.
The misfolded.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting that in meetings, I have to say something that to you is going to sound incredibly obvious, but it has to be said for people to remember that there are two ends of protein homeostasis. I have to say proteins can only function when they are normal.
Okay. It sounds
right. It sounds like it should not need to be said, but has to be said because we forget about that. We think that things begin literally de novo when we have pathology, forgetting that pathology today was earlier normal protein that no longer can function. The certainty in the whole think of protein compromise in neurodegeneration is that as we find that these proteins react against something, by the way, the nature of it is different in different people, but the common denominator is that these proteins are undergoing a transformation from soluble to insoluble, from their native monomeric form to this fibrillar form, called amyloid states, plaques in the case of Alzheimer's, Lewy bodies in the case of Parkinson, but also from functional to non-functional. That's a certainty. The minute that there is a cross-beta configuration for any protein, that state isn't functioning anymore. And therefore, that protein has ceased to function. What we have embraced is the uncertainty that somehow once it turns into its amyloid state, it becomes a toxin.
And that's what you refer to as a proteinopathy paradigm, isn't it? Which
exactly.
Again, you said
exactly.
You said it unleashed the search and destroy mission targeting these proteins. And
exactly.
Also, monoclonal antibodies have been kind of generated to destroy these abnormal proteins. So are you kind of arguing, which I assume you're saying, is that these misfolded proteins are not the causes of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's? We've got it all wrong.
That's absolutely right. They are a sign of a normal brain reacting against a variety of age-related, biological, toxic, even infectious exposures. This is why when something happened to any of us, one of the first things that are understood and discovered is that there is a greater level in the tissue affected of what we call pathology, of aggregated synuclein, of aggregated amyloid beta, et cetera, et cetera. There are different proteins. Synuclein is well known to have so many functions. And it is well established as part of the innate immune system. And that's why if you have E. coli in mice, the most characteristic change is the marked aggregation of synuclein, so that you have a lot of it in the colon where the E. coli infection is greatest. That bit of research has been the basis of confirming that which we already knew, which is that Parkinson's begins in the colon simply because we get this aggregated protein there. But with the same body of data, you can say that E. coli represents an injury that the colon reacts against by building aggregated synuclein. It simply requires seeing that you are understanding an injury of, in this case, infectious nature, and seeing an effect. And what happens is that once E. coli is treated, the aggregated synuclein goes away. Okay. So nothing about that body of data is against the concept that this is almost an acute phase reactant, that you see an increase of it in reaction to the injury, in this case, of the infection. But it can be of many other things. So to me, it's fascinating. The field of Alzheimer's has the same concept, and I go into this one example in the book, which is this famous, by now famous, experiment in which people who were PET negative, PET with a ligand for amyloid,
Yes.
were asked to sleep deprive themselves one night. Try to sleep very little, only one night. And the next day they underwent the PET, and lo and behold, was now positive. They now have amyloid in the brains.
Okay.
Conclusion of the study: sleep deprivation increases the risk for Alzheimer's. It's a cause of Alzheimer's. The word causality wasn't quite used in that particular paper, but the implication was there. And when you think through that conclusion, you say, well, it kind of makes sense. People with Alzheimer's have sleep problems, so this might be part of the issue. With the same body of data, you can also conclude that sleep deprivation represents a sort of injury the brain reacts against by the amyloid. And that if individuals then sleep okay the next day, that will go away also. So
Yes.
it's quite fascinating. That's why we call it Brain Fables. Because the many stories about the brain that we've created are logical. They're logical, and we think that their main magnetism
Yes.
is that it's created around a villain. For Parkinson's, that villain is called synuclein. Blue bodies. For Alzheimer's, that villain is amyloid plaques and tau tangles. For progressive supranuclear palsy, that villain is tau in a variety of different. So it's usually the proteins are the bad guys. And the unfortunate problem with the idea is that we have these proteins everywhere in the brain. By the way, synuclein in particular is everyone in the body. We have synuclein in every single tissue, including red blood cells. It's preserved in prehistoric genomes even before we came to Earth. It's all around the animal kingdom, and evolutionary forces made it redundant with gamma synuclein and beta synuclein. So we have synuclein up the wazoo. Do we think that evolutionary forces preserve this protein so that we would have our built-in mechanism for self-selection out of nature?
It's a thought.
Right, it makes no sense. So it's fascinating that we have made this ubiquitous protein somehow our greatest source of toxicity, when in fact there in humans no evidence whatsoever of it. The idea has been generated, and the only way to quote prove it is to create animal models in which you fill them up with these pathologies. They get sick, you get it out, you get the pathology out, they get better, and of course you can prove causality there. But in humans, it's never been proven, because it is not the case.
Yeah, so many studies you've cited where removing the abnormal protein hasn't made any difference. But the other argument you made, actually, apart from the abnormal proteins being the villains, you're actually arguing that they're actually heroes. They might actually be protecting the brain, and you use a few analogies, the arsonist and the woodpecker.
Right.
Yeah, are they actually being helpful then? Are they kind of a reaction to protect the brain from some other damage rather than being the villains?
Absolutely. So we, of course, have a lot of indirect evidence for that to be the case, because it's very hard to use in living individuals microdialytic mechanisms to be able to measure the proteins and their effects directly in living people. But in Alzheimer's, where we have data of both ends of the protein homeostasis, we have data of the soluble fraction of the protein in spinal fluid, and we have data of the insoluble fraction of the protein in the PET. Essentially, we can determine how much of the protein levels individuals have. And a paradox in the field of Alzheimer's that we were able to resolve a few years back was the idea that so many of us have amyloid plaques in our brains and have no problems. In fact, as I allude to in the book, by the age of 85, 60% of all of us living on Earth have amyloid plaques in our brain. So we define the biological criteria, as it's called, for Alzheimer's. And yet, 4/5 of us, so most of us with amyloid toward the end of our life, will never have dementia. So how to resolve the paradox is to determine if the problem is that we need to account for the other end of the protein homeostasis. And what we found is that people who remain normal, most of us, continue to generate levels of the normal protein above a certain compensation threshold. In fact, we identified that threshold very specifically, 800 picograms per milliliter. No matter how much amyloid there is in the brain, most individuals above that threshold will be normal. And even ask the same question, people who have a mutation that predicts will develop Alzheimer's, and everyone with amyloid not yet affected cognitively, and ask a simple question: does the level of A beta 42 at baseline serve to predict who will go on to develop dementia within 3 years and who will remain cognitively normal, with the hypothesis that those who high levels will remain normal? And that's exactly what we found. And again, it didn't matter how much of the brain amyloid there was. So we already know that proteins are in the brain for a good reason, and that they need to be in a certain level. And that level is invariably low in people with Alzheimer's and with Parkinson's. In Alzheimer's, no one with dementia has normal levels of A beta 42. It's invariably low. Conversely, so many of us have amyloid plaques in our brains, and we're fine. And we will ever be fine. The odds are we will never develop the condition that we predict amyloid plaques are going to lead us into. But not a single person with dementia will have high levels of A beta 42. It's invariably low. So that correlation there is very, very tight, 1-to-1.
Irrespective of how many plaques are in the brain.
Exactly. We did an analysis according to tertiles of plaques, and even the highest tertiles of plaques, people who have the most, will still be normal if they have high levels of A beta 42. Admittedly, the more, in fact, this is something we confirmed, the more plaques there are, the higher the levels of the beta 42 necessary to preserve normal cognition.
This correlation is quite interesting. I think the other thing that kind of surprised me is the overlap between patients classified as having Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, having both types of pathologies. So somebody with Parkinson's having Alzheimer type pathology, and vice versa, people with Parkinson's having Alzheimer type pathology. How do you explain that?
Well, that's another
overlap.
It's a very important issue. So we think Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are very different diseases because we define them along the clinical pathologic axis. They have a certain variety of features, motor difficulties, and the pathology is Lewy body. That's what it is. It's Parkinson's. Now, you could then say, of course, as we age, we could develop a second disease, right? Supposedly that's true. Now, what are the odds of developing Alzheimer's if you have Parkinson's? You would think by virtue of chance, at most, maybe 15%, maybe 20%. But it turns out that every single clinical pathology study of brain banks have shown that when you take pathology-proven Parkinson's brains and ask the question how many of them would also meet criteria for Alzheimer's, that number comes up to very close to 80%. So that makes no sense. That's no longer a chance. That would be an association. So here we are in the uncomfortable situation of explaining to patients, by the way, my diagnosis is Parkinson's. However, you need to know that Parkinson's is a very unlikely condition in which 8 out of 10 patients go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. That right there, even that no further discussion on any other topic, tells us that this idea of Parkinson's is in our imagination. That where Parkinson's begins and where it ends is all what we think of it, what we've made of it. but it's really not at all based on truly unbiased, objective look at the data. If we are to develop treatments to slow progression at the individual level, that is going to require for us to move away from the idea that pathology is a driver of disease and that somehow we need to try to push it out of the brain. Because when you think about it at the most fundamental level, if we have established these diseases to be proteinopathies, they are diseases of the proteins. Removing the proteins will be the solution. And the thing is that we've done that time and again. We have decades of having accomplished that. It just so happened that the outcome doesn't follow because it cannot follow. And incidentally, I have to say this to you, Ibrahim, because this is so paradigmatic of who we are as a field. Neurologists, especially those working in the field of neurodegeneration, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and others, are the only members of the medical species that does trials, that do trials to learn. We do trials to learn. Sounds great. Sounds magnanimous. Sounds fantastic, actually. Wow, we're so curious. But every other field of medicine does trials to test hypotheses. If we are to relate and make it very clear that we're doing trials to learn, we are effectively rendering the hypotheses unfalsifiable. We never start an article of a therapy that we think is going to slow progression in Parkinson's by the statement, we conducted this trial to test the hypothesis that. We don't do that. We said, here's a trial that we're doing to enhance mitochondrial function. All right, that sounds good. Enough said. I no need to mention the hypothesis, right? Because how could it be bad to enhance mitochondrial function? Well, so all of those molecular interventions, as you know, be negative, all of them invariably. That's because the statement has never been, we tested this molecule to confirm or refute the hypothesis that we never started. So then the explanations of their lessons that we are acquiring from these trials is that the trials weren't good enough, that the dose was too high, the dose was too low, the sensitivity of the implant was inadequate, and our favorite excuse that patients were too advanced, that horses out of the barnyard,
Yes.
right?
Let's get them earlier. Let's get them
Exactly.
earlier in the diagnosis. Yeah.
Earlier is the solution. And certainly earlier is better when you know what you're doing. But in other field of medicine, we have an earlier applicable intervention when it wasn't first determined to be effective at the disease state. Oncology has deployed treatments earlier when they first demonstrated that it was effective at a cancer state, when the molecular match between the intervention and the recipients was identified, and that molecular assay was used to then understand patients that could be treated with that intervention earlier. We think that those trial treatments in the disease state will all be effective once we test them in the prodromal or preclinical state, and I think that's falling. But all of this is the result of protecting our hypothesis. I joke about the idea that we neurologists create ideas. Then the next step is to conclude they are brilliant. And then the step 3 is to do the experiments to prove, to show how brilliant the ideas are. And of course, the experiments are messy, are not perfect enough. And so we need to keep on changing them, change a variety of different components of the experiments we do. But we never go back and say, it is time to change the idea. We don't.
And I guess your book was the flag. Let's take a hold. And you did write that in 20 years, the war against beta amyloid has not given us any positive return on investment. And you clearly cited enough evidence to show that. Why hasn't the paradigm shifted? Why haven't we taken a pause and look back and see why this isn't working and why we're still in that?
Well, it's a very important question, and I don't know. I know exactly what the answer is. It may be that it's a combination of factors. I alluded to one, which is our cultural element, that trials are not done to test hypotheses, but to learn. And so the lessons are never our ideas could be wrong. But there is also this concept that because we think we are so smart, so we're so intelligent, that is very clear. We have done only things that increase our knowledge incrementally. And that's why when the 200-year anniversary of the shaking palsy essay that Dr. James Parkinson published in 1817, in 2017, a famous neurologist that shall remain nameless for this particular interview was asked, how close are we to the cure? How close are we to realizing a cure for Parkinson's disease? And he said, when we put together a puzzle, you know how we start working from the corners in? He said, we have the corners covered. I don't know what that means, by the way, but it supposedly means we're fewer pieces away from completing the full puzzle and saying, here, this is the Parkinson's history. We're done. Now that we have all the pieces together, of course, the cure is next. So why have we not moved away? Is because we use this word, we work on the shoulder of giants, which essentially means the people that preceded us were so brilliant, their ideas cannot be impeached. They are absolute truths. We don't question their ideas. Must be the case. And there is a little bit, I think, on all of us of protectionism. If you work on something and you've gotten to a certain point, you want to look back and say, this is my legacy, and my legacy shall not be attacked in any way. And that's also probably a part of it. And then lastly, I would say it's because the investments made are so large on this idea that it has become too big to fail. Just like in the crisis, remember the financial crisis of 2008, when these big banks were so big, they were too big to fail. You have to bail them out. This is very similar to what has happened. We've just invested so much into the same thing. We've collected all of us around this idea that, this is $1 trillion or more of wealth put into this, that it has to work. And that is why we have this thing called lecanemab or Leqembi. We were going to have it. One day or another, we were going to have Leqembi. And it's the absolute worst thing that patients can be given. But we have it. It's approved in the United States. It's actually quite profitable to medical centers. People like me would stand to profit handsomely by trying to treat as many people as possible with this. But of course, once you look at what it does and what the results are of what it does, you know that what you're chasing is a hope that's empty, that's toxic, that is only offering the illusion of progress.
It reminds me of
exactly
sunk cost fallacy.
Double down on it.
Double down on it. You kind of want to. Well, you did mention the issue of infection, and I know there's a lot of talk about how much infection is part of this neurodegenerative diseases. And one of the concepts was this prion-like nature of Parkinson's disease. How, kind of, yes or no, is Parkinson's disease a prion-like disease?
No.
Okay. That saves me from digging down. Okay.
It is not at all. So the prion concept was created 40 years ago by a Nobel Prize winner, Stan Kusner. And he had postulated that because the proteins treated with ultraviolet lights could still retain its ability to propagate, that then these were, quote, infectious proteins, sort of where prions came to be. And he articulated that although nucleic acid was not part of the replication mechanism, and I'm using replication with quotes, that there will be a templating code within the proteins, potentially made of the amino acid sequence, that will one day be found to explain the behavior. Well, 40 years later, it has not been found because it doesn't exist. There is not infectivity in proteins of any kind. But what happens is that one of the mechanisms of phase transformation of proteins from soluble to insoluble, to the amyloid state, is called seeding. And seeding requires essentially four ingredients: temperature, pH, a catalyst, which could be too much proteins, could be, and one important one, which is supersaturation. That is a level of concentration that's millions of times above physiologic level. So in Parkinson's brains, we're dealing with concentrations at the picomolar level. The seeding mechanisms require a concentration at the micromolar. That is a difference literally of a 1 million times above. So whatever we think is happening in a laboratory setting that generates seeding, which is the equivalent of prion spread, is not what really happens in the human brain with or without Parkinson's. And so there is no such thing as active propagation. And seeding, by the way, is a passive phenomenon. Once something called the nucleation barrier is overcome, this is a process that continues on. It's like a switch turned on. You begin to then have all these proteins undergo the process of aggregation, which is according to the physics, is very similar to crystallization. Follows the same physical principles of crystallization. It obeys the second law of thermodynamics and gives free energy. That explains the whole thing. You don't have to argue that there is a secret replication mechanism within proteins. So if that isn't the case for prion disease, much less is going to be the case for the prion-like conditions such as Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, multiple system atrophy, and others that have been articulated as if they somehow represent new prion disorders. Not at all. And it's important to discuss these issues because, of course, once you buy into an idea, then millions of dollars are going to be invested in it. I don't care so much about the wealth that is being drained, but the people's lives that are put at stake for the defense of our ideas. That is really what bothers me the most. That's where there is a line there. Right? Don't care about the business side of things if it is well generated, but the line to me is crossed when that requires putting patients at risk for something that couldn't possibly work, simply because we think it will.
Yeah, I think tough questions for our specialty and for neuroscience. Where do we go from here? What are we back to the drawing board then, trying to get models, or what do we do?
So the first thing is to say, Ibrahim, that it's not. We're not arguing that proteins are irrelevant. Proteins are very relevant. We're not saying synuclein has nothing to do with it. Synuclein has a lot to do with it, but not in the manner that we have conceived it. It's not that synuclein is non-toxic, it's that we're losing synuclein. So one important change to get to where we need to is to recognize that neurodegeneration, by whatever name we give, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, whatever, is a process of loss. It is not a cancer. We're not gaining anything. Whatever goes up in relative terms in a process of neurodegeneration is probably reactive, if not straight protective. We cannot treat neurodegeneration as if it were a cancer, which is what we've been doing. We've been trying to eliminate these proteins as if they have a mass occupying effect in the brain. No, the brain is shrinking. So it's not as if we need to shrink it faster, which is, by the way, what happens with lecanemab and other monoclonal antibodies. We're shrinking it in an accelerated fashion with this treatment, pretending that we don't know what the consequences of a smaller brain are. So that's number one, is to recognize that proteins are very important and that we're losing them in the process of degeneration by whatever mechanism. And the reason that's critical is because it can be rescued. It's easier to give something that we're losing than to try to remove something that's doing nothing to us. Now, the other element that we need to consider is that there are today therapies that have been created that are likely disease modifying or neuroprotective to some individuals. And we need to figure out who they are. It's not that all of these molecules that we've tested and proven futile in trials of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's were all of them invariably, in retrospect, junk pieces of chemistry, but rather that what we never did was to pair those treatments to individuals with the biology to benefit from them. And so that is a harder thing to do, but essentially it's the principle of precision medicine, according to which every patient will be treated according to the disease he or she has, molecularly speaking. We need assays to get to that point. And this is something that we're doing in Cincinnati. We're having a large cohort of individuals with a variety of different neurodegenerative diseases. The independent variable is not that which we at the bedside said it was. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, you name it. That's not our independent variable. That's our dependent variable. We're deeply phenotyping people, but all our analyses are blinded to the clinical labels. We do want to know who individuals are that are within a specific molecular change, an assay range of abnormalities, about which particularly there is a therapy today that could in fact correct that change. So we can do that. It's a lot of work. It's harder work. It's conceivably not as sexy of a work because you're not curing a disease, but you're curing individuals. You can do that at a small level. And if we start having small successes, we can then increase that little by little. And eventually we can have a situation in which we have, of course, a larger chunk of patients that have a disease modifying treatment. To me, the best example is provided by the field of cystic fibrosis. By the way, cystic fibrosis has one gene that is affected. So it's a monogenic disease. And we neurologists often think monogenic disease, meaning one gene equals one disease, which is not true. And in cystic fibrosis, the first success happened only about 12 years ago, literally 2012, when the first treatment that should have worked for everyone because it was doing something that supposedly was going to correct what the gene doesn't quite, the mutation affects, only ended up being effective for this very small subset of people. Now, the big trial initially failed. They did a smaller trial with just those individuals that, in retrospect, were the only ones that benefited. We had the same mutation, obviously the same gene mutation, but the kind of enzymatic change that it led to was different to the 96% that didn't have any business with it. Well, they then did a trial just with those individuals and had the first disease-modifying treatment. That was 4% of individuals. Now, 70, some people argue, almost 80% of cystic fibrosis patients have a combination therapy. But the first success in a monogenic lung degenerative disease first worked in a very small subset of individuals. We need to know that precision medicine starts in small chunks. That splitting is mandatory. We cannot continue to lump if we're going to do precision medicine. And I tell my patients, please ask yourself if you're ever invited by anyone to a trial of a putative disease-modifying intervention, why me? And if the answer is because you have early Parkinson's disease, that's the wrong answer. No, what is it about me that makes me a suitable candidate for the intervention you're testing, and why others might not be? And so far, we're not prepared for that yet, but I think that we should, because it's the only way forward. Not as sexy, but very practical, and certainly the only way that other fields of medicine have achieved success.
And is that the concept behind this CCBP study? You're kind of matching therapies to patients without taking into consideration what the clinical diagnosis is.
Exactly. That's absolutely correct. That is the philosophy behind it. For now, it's a study, but I would hope that it will become a standard of care, because it is not different to what happens to individuals who are treated, are understood from other fields of medicine. In oncology, a patient may be told at the bedside, you have liver cancer, but I don't know what that means. I would have to do a variety of different studies before we know what disease it is, before we know how to treat it. So we hope the same model would happen. The honest statement that we can make is for patients to know that the diagnosis we're using, say in that case, a case would be Parkinson's disease, but we should hasten to add, we don't know what it means. You're blazing your own trail, but we can begin to try to understand what are the different elements that are abnormal biologically, to try to determine what actual disease you have so that we can treat the disease at an individualized level. Meanwhile, here's levodopa to make you feel better. So we probably still need the symptomatic treatments, but we need to be mindful that that is simply something that will help patients be better, but is not treating their disease. The disease needs to be understood, and certainly what's going to stop, reverse, cure James Parkinson's might not do anything, or might be harmful for Mary or George's, right? And so I hope that we'll get there, and that's why this is not a study that will have an end. I suspect this is going to be hopefully far beyond my own life on this planet, and I hope that this will be a paradigm that other patients will benefit from.
I hope so. There's the joke, isn't it, that neurologists know so much but do very little to cure their patients.
Exactly.
We do need to be able to cure these conditions. Okay. I mean, you've given me so many takeaways from the book. Is there anyone you would like to highlight that's kind of, this is, if somebody picks the book, these are the one or two things they should take home away from it?
Well, I like for people to use the book as a way to go through some of the different ways to look at any data. There are different ways to look at any body of data, literally. And this book is meant to go over the key milestones that were published, about which we have a different interpretation. Same data, we're not changing the experiment, we're not changing anything about the variables, we're just simply looking at data as if we had zero biases. The book is really a call for change, as you know. This is saying to us that nature really doesn't give a damn if our ideas are false. They're not going to work. Nature is merciless in that regard. And thinking too high of our ideas is the wrong way to go about. Ultimately, I hope that what the book accomplishes is to be skeptical about everything we hear about, especially because we do a lot of science trying to be right as opposed to trying to search for the truth. Our patients don't care who's right and who's wrong. They don't care about that. I've been wrong more times than I'm comfortable admitting. But it's important to know that if you're wrong, you want to make sure you move away from those ideas quickly.
Well, we know that they say the only way new paradigms take over is when the old generation of the practitioners pass on. And hopefully your ideas have seeded very well in the younger people coming up. And hopefully we'll get a change in the future. My last question usually is, what are there any books you would like to recommend? I usually say about 3 books, either on this topic or something about the brain.
Well, I think all of us should read The Structure of Scientific Revolution by Thomas Kuhn. It's a classic. I was told that I needed to read it many, many years ago, and I never did. And eventually I did. I read that book about 5 years ago, and it's such a beautiful book. And the key message is this idea of what paradigms do to us, and how knowledge doesn't quite increase incrementally in the matter we think, but rather by leaps. And leaps sometimes serve what we say paradigm shift. But it's such a very important book because engulfed in many of the ideas that at their time were so much thought to be the truth, and how progress required to have moved away from those ideas, because even the calculations that needed to be made for progress couldn't be possibly articulated within the wrong paradigm. And so it's a great book, and that I highly recommend it.
An old classic. That's good.
Yeah, I like classic.
I haven't read
Of course,
it.
I recommend your book too. I hope that people read your book, because I know that you've distilled a lot of knowledge into it, and it is in my to read list. So
Okay.
I will provide you with my feedback before long.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alberto Espay, for participating in this episode of the Neurology Lounge podcast. I'm most grateful for your time and your wisdom. And to my audience, thank you for listening or watching the podcast. If you found it enlightening, as Alberto said, why not have a look at my book, Surfing the Brain? And for the academic-minded, I have a neurology database called NeuroChecklist. You might want to have a look at that. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the podcast, why not subscribe to the iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube channels of the podcast? But until then, thank you very much for listening. And Alberto, thank you very much for your time once again. I'm most grateful.
My pleasure, Brand. It was a joy. Thank you.